My mother posted 52 photos of her luxury Mediterranean cruise, paid for entirely by the trust fund my late husband left for our 7-year-old daughter's medical care. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I simply opened my laptop and began downloading 7 years of financial records. 72 hours later, their world collapsed and they never saw it coming. Mark died when Lily was barely 3. The accident was sudden, leaving a void so vast it felt like all the oxygen had been sucked out of my life. Before he passed, Mark, ever the meticulous planner, set up a restrictive trust for Lily. It was designed specifically for her future education and ongoing medical expenses. Lily was born with moderate hearing loss and required specialized cochlear implant maintenance. In the fog of early grief, I made the biggest mistake of my life. I allowed my mother, Eleanor, to be named as a co-trustee. I was 28, drowning in medical bills and the terror of single motherhood. My mother, a retired accountant projecting absolute financial competence, offered to handle the administrative burden so I could focus on Lily. I believed her. That is what you do when broken. You lean on the people supposed to hold you up. But I should have known better. I grew up in the shadow of the golden child. My older brother Thomas was the sun around which my parents orbited. Thomas was a charismatic, perpetually struggling entrepreneur whose businesses always required one more bridge loan from mom and dad. I was the reliable one, the quiet one, the one who married a solid man and never asked for a dime. In a healthy family, that makes you a source of pride. In my family, it made me a resource. It made me the baseline of stability they could exploit to fund Thomas's endless string of failures. For years, I swallowed the blatant favoritism. I watched my parents buy Thomas a new SUV while I took the bus. I watched them pay for his destination wedding while Mark and I eloped. Whenever I expressed hurt, my mother would employ her favorite weapon, gaslighting. "You are being overly sensitive," she would say. "Thomas needs a head start. You are capable. You don't need help." I accepted this. I kept my mouth shut to maintain harmony. Looking back now, I realize exactly what that silent endurance costs you. We are taught from a young age that keeping the peace is a noble virtue. But keeping the peace is rarely about actual peace. Most of the time, it is just a polite name for slow self-destruction. When you are the scapegoat in a family system built around a golden child, your boundaries are treated as acts of aggression. The golden child is allowed to take, to demand, to drain resources without consequence because their needs are paramount. Meanwhile, your independence is weaponized against you. You are punished for surviving on your own. You convince yourself that staying quiet is an act of maturity, but what you are really doing is teaching them that your pain has no value. You are training them to believe that your boundaries are merely suggestions. The system relies entirely on your willingness to absorb their dysfunction without complaining. You become the shock absorber for their toxic choices, and the moment you step out of your designated role, they will try to destroy you to maintain their comfortable illusion. The trust fund was supposed to be untouchable. Disbursements required both signatures. Every 6 months, my mother and I would sign the paperwork and release funds for Lily's specialized tutors. Then Thomas's latest venture imploded. He owed money to investors. He owed money to the IRS. He was looking at fraud charges if he didn't secure a massive injection of cash. Suddenly, my mother was calling me daily. She asked probing questions about the trust's balance. She talked about how unfair it was that this money gathered dust while family was in crisis. I told her no. I told her firmly that the money belonged to Lily alone. I didn't know it then, but my refusal wasn't the end of the conversation for her. It was merely an obstacle she had decided to bypass. Tuesday morning in mid-October, my phone buzzed with an alert from the wealth management portal. I opened the app, expecting the usual statement. Instead, I saw a single, catastrophic withdrawal of $85,000. My blood ran cold. The numbers on the screen blurred. Mark had worked 70-hour weeks specifically to ensure that figure remained secure. That money was the safety net for the implant replacements Lily would inevitably need. I frantically clicked the transaction details, my hands shaking. The destination account was masked, but the authorization code indicated a wire transfer initiated in person, utilizing a secondary verification protocol. I called the wealth management firm. The automated system kept me on hold for eternity. When a representative finally answered, I demanded an explanation. "Ma'am, that withdrawal was authorized yesterday afternoon," the polite voice informed me. "By the co-trustee, Alina Davies." The paperwork was filed with an emergency medical addendum. My mother had forged an emergency medical addendum for Lily to bypass my signature. I stood in the silence of my kitchen. This wasn't just a betrayal. This was theft. This was my mother stealing the future right out of her disabled granddaughter's hands to bail out her golden child. I knew if I called her, she would twist it. She would play the victim. She would somehow make it my fault for not being generous in the first place. What I'm about to tell you is the part I almost left out. But you need to hear it. I didn't reach for my phone to call her. I reached for my keys. I walked out, locked the door behind me, and drove straight to the bank. What I have told you so far is how they broke me down. What comes next is how I built back with absolute, surgical precision. I sat in the quiet, sterile office of the branch manager who had known my late husband. I handed him my identification and requested the withdrawal authorization forms. When he slid the paper across the desk, I saw it. My mother's signature, crisp and confident, next to a heavily redacted forged hospital letterhead claiming Lily required emergency experimental surgery. The audacity of it took my breath away for a microsecond. Then the cold settled in. I did not cry. I took action. I requested certified copies of every single document associated with the transfer, the IP logs of the portal access, and the wire routing numbers. "Mr. Harrison looked at me with deep concern, offering to call the police right then. I told him no. A police report would trigger a messy, immediate panic. I needed them comfortable. I needed them completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet was already gone. I drove home in silence. When I walked through the door, my phone buzzed. It was a notification from Instagram. My mother had just uploaded an album titled Mediterranean Blessings. 52 photos of her, my father, and Thomas's entire family standing on the deck of a luxury yacht in Santorini. Thomas was holding a glass of champagne, grinning at the camera. The caption reads, "Celebrating Thomas's massive new business milestone. Family is everything." They had taken Lily's ear surgery money, laundered it through Thomas's failing LLC to show fraudulent business revenue, and then immediately siphoned it out to pay for a celebratory, 5-star European vacation. It was a staggering level of financial depravity. They felt so invincible, so utterly convinced of my subjugation that they broadcasted their theft in high definition. I did not know it then, but those photos were the exact pieces of evidence that would upgrade their crime into a federal nightmare. I spent the next 3 days doing nothing but building my paper trail. Let me tell you something about financial abuse, because people often misunderstand it. Financial abuse is still abuse, and it leaves evidence. When dealing with a family system that relies on gaslighting, you cannot fight them with emotions or accusations. If you scream, you are crazy. If you cry, you are unstable. But documents do not cry, and bank routing numbers do not care about your mother's narrative. A paper trail is the ultimate equalizer. When you discover financial theft, your first instinct is usually confrontation. You want to demand answers. You want to see the guilt in their eyes. Suppress that urge. The moment you confront a narcissist, they begin destroying evidence and spinning a smear campaign to discredit you. You must secure the documents first. You lock down the accounts, you pull the records, and you build an airtight timeline before they even realize you are looking. A legally binding trust document signed before the conflict is your basic self-preservation. It meant that every dollar moved out of that account had a legal chain of custody. I hired an attorney who specialized in trust litigation and a forensic accountant. We sat in a sterile conference room for 6 hours tracking the $85,000. My mother had wired the funds to Thomas's business account ostensibly as a consulting fee to mask the injection of cash. Thomas then used the business account to pay for the cruise, writing it off as a corporate retreat to avoid personal tax liability. It was a sloppy, arrogant maneuver. Thomas already had a history of tax liens. By funneling stolen trust money through his business and falsely claiming a luxury vacation as a corporate expense, he had effectively committed both wire fraud and tax evasion in a single stroke. The forensic accountant smiled a thin, predatory smile that I will never forget. My mother texted me from Greece. "Thinking of you and Lily. Wish you could have made the time to join us. Maybe next year." The sheer psychological violence of that message was staggering. She was mocking me, assuming I was too stupid to check the trust balance until our next scheduled disbursement in December. I replied, "Hope you are having a wonderful time. We will catch up when you get back. I am planning a little family dinner for your return." I kept my voice steady in the text, projecting the exact image of the clueless, subservient daughter she expected. My attorney drafted the necessary paperwork. We filed an emergency injunction in probate court to freeze my mother's assets, citing breach of fiduciary duty. But that was merely the civil side. The real masterpiece was the package we prepared for the Internal Revenue Service. We compiled the forged medical addendum, the wire transfer receipts, Thomas's corporate filings, and high-resolution printouts of all 52 vacation photos. We submitted a formal whistleblower report to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. They were scheduled to fly back into JFK Airport on a Tuesday afternoon. I spent the weekend packing my bags, not to run away, but to ensure Lily and I were insulated from the blast radius. I moved our essential belongings into a secure short-term rental. I changed our phone numbers, leaving only a burner phone active for the final play. I wanted them to come home to the perfect illusion of normalcy. I wanted them to walk into that family dinner feeling rested, tanned, and victorious. I had arranged for the dinner to take place at a private dining room in my parents' favorite country club. It was the exact kind of pretentious environment my mother lived for. She loved an audience. She loved the performance of being a wealthy, benevolent matriarch. I decided it was only fitting to give her the grand stage she had always desperately craved. But before the appetizers even arrived, I would ensure she lost everything. That was the preparation. Now here is the execution, where all the careful planning collided with their profound arrogance. I arrived at the Oak Ridge Country Club 30 minutes early. The private dining room was suffocatingly elegant, walls lined with dark oak. I instructed the waitstaff to bring water and leave us entirely alone. I sat at the head of the heavy mahogany table, my briefcase resting against my right leg. I am not going to pretend I was completely devoid of emotion. My palms were sweating so heavily I had to keep wiping them on my dark dress. When I tried to open the brass clasp of my briefcase to check the folders one last time, my fingers fumbled and jammed the lock. It was a humiliating, imperfect moment, a brief flash of the terrified, compliant daughter trying to claw her way back to the surface. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and forced her down into the dark. At precisely 7 o'clock, the heavy double doors swung open. My mother, my father, Thomas, and his wife breezed into the room, a parade of sun-kissed entitlement. My mother immediately took the center stage, dropping a designer shopping bag onto an empty chair. "Darling, it was absolutely divine. You simply must see the Aegean in October," she announced, her voice booming off the oak panels. "Thomas negotiated such a brilliant rate for the luxury yacht. He truly has a gift for high-level business. It really is a terrible shame you are always so dreadfully tied down with your obligations and cannot join the family." I let out a short, humorless laugh. I did not stand up to greet them, nor did I offer a polite smile. "I suppose somebody has to stay behind and finance those obligations, Mother," I replied, my voice steady and cold. I lifted the thick manila folder from my briefcase and pushed it directly to the center of the table. It slid across the polished wood and stopped right in front of her perfectly manicured hands. It was not a menu. It was a 40-page index dossier containing the forged emergency medical addendum, the certified IP logs from her laptop, the wire transfer authorizations, and the formal Times Tamp submission receipt from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. She opened the cover with a dismissive sigh. Then she saw the federal seal. She stopped speaking mid-sentence. Her eyes darted rapidly across the top page, tracking the highlighted routing numbers that traced $85,000 from her disabled granddaughter's medical trust TLY into Thomas's fraudulent corporate account. The smug matriarch vanished in a fraction of a second, replaced instantly by a hollow, terrified old woman. Her hands began to tremble so violently that the heavy legal parchment rattled loudly against the mahogany table. She opened her mouth to speak, to spin a lie, to gaslight me one last time, but absolutely no sound came out. The room went dead silent. Thomas leaned over her shoulder to inspect the paperwork, and within 3 seconds, his face drained of color as he recognized his own falsified LLC tax filings attached to the crew. Eyes receipts. You have exactly 72 hours before the federal audits begin, I said. People who scream the loudest about family loyalty are almost always the ones who have done the absolute least to actually earn it. They use the word family not as a bond of unconditional love, but as a strict compliance mechanism. When a toxic family member demands loyalty, what they are really demanding is your complete silence regarding their abuse. Enforcing your boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of clarity. You cannot reason with someone who actively benefits from misunderstanding you. You can only remove their access to you. My father finally spoke up. Now hold on, let's not overreact, he stammered, adjusting his tie nervously. Your mother was just trying to help your brother through a temporary cash flow issue. The money was always going to be put back. There is no need to involve authorities over a family misunderstanding. I turned my gaze to him. The sheer audacity of his rationalization was breathtaking. It stopped being a simple family misunderstanding the moment she forged a medical document claiming my 7-year-old daughter needed experimental surgery. I stated calmly, "That is not a cash flow issue, Dad. That is felony wire fraud." And Thomas writing off a Mediterranean cruise as a corporate retreat using stolen trust funds? That is federal tax evasion. The IRS does not care about imaginary future contracts. They care about the paper trail. Thomas finally found his voice. It was the frantic, high-pitched whine of a cornered child. "You are destroying my business," he yelled, slamming his hands on the table. "You are ruining my life over a technicality. I needed that money to keep the LLC afloat. If the IRS audits me, I will lose the house. How could you do this to your own brother?" "I did not do anything to you, Thomas," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "You stole from your niece. You committed tax fraud. I handed your actions over to the people whose job it is to process them. If your life is ruined, it is because you ruined it." My mother finally found her breath. Tears streamed down her powdered face. This was her ultimate weapon, the final maneuver she used to control the narrative since I was a little girl. "I am your mother," she sobbed, reaching a shaking hand across the table. "I sacrificed everything for you. How can you be so heartless? We can fix this. Please, just withdraw the report. We will sell Thomas's cars. We will remortgage the house. We will pay Lily back. Please do not send your brother to prison." I sat there in the silence, watching the woman who had ruthlessly tormented me for 30 years beg for mercy, and I realized my careful plan was only half complete. Walking out of that room felt like victory. But the next 72 hours taught me what victory actually costs. They didn't collapse quietly. They collapsed loudly, messily, and in a way that exposed exactly who they had always been. My mother's sobbing reached a fever pitch, echoing off the expensive oak panels. She lunged across the heavy mahogany table, not to hit me, but to grab the thick dossier. She thought if she physically destroyed the paper sitting in front of her, the reality of the incoming federal investigation would somehow magically disappear. It was a pathetic, desperate clawing at a narrative she no longer controlled. In her frantic reach, she knocked over a crystal water pitcher, shattering it into jagged pieces across the polished floor. The heavy double doors swung open, and the club manager stepped in, his face a mask of practiced discretion attempting to hide genuine horror. I didn't stay to watch them explain the broken glass to the staff. I picked up my briefcase, turned my back on the golden child and his enablers, and walked out into the cool October night. I thought I was entirely ready for that moment. I wasn't, not entirely. As I reached my car, my hands were shaking so badly I dropped my keys under the front tire. I had to kneel on the cold, greasy asphalt in my good dress, blindly sweeping my hand back and forth until my freezing fingers finally brushed the metal. I sat in the driver's seat for 20 long minutes, the engine completely off, staring at the steering wheel while my heart hammered against my ribs. It is a strange, hollow feeling when the adrenaline completely leaves your body, and you finally realize the family you thought you had is officially, irrevocably gone. I started the engine and drove to the secure rental where Lily was sleeping. By Thursday morning, the smear campaign began exactly as I had anticipated. My burner phone started lighting up with aggressive text messages from extended family members, aunts, and cousins I had not spoken to in years. My mother had spun a masterful, hysterical narrative. She claimed I was undergoing a severe mental breakdown, that grief had finally driven me completely insane, and that I was trying to bankrupt my own brother over a harmless account. In error. The messages ranged from deeply concerned to outright vicious. They accused me of being heartless, of tearing the family apart, of weaponizing my daughter's disability for petty revenge. I read every single one of those messages, and I did not reply to a single one. Let me tell you about the profound difference between guilt and shame, because understanding this critical distinction is what kept me from breaking down during those first few agonizing weeks. Guilt is the feeling that you have done something objectively wrong. Shame is the deeply implanted belief that you inherently are something wrong. Narcissistic family systems do not deal in guilt, they deal exclusively in shame. When my mother launched her smear campaign, she wasn't trying to make me feel guilty about reporting a crime. She was trying to trigger the profound shame she had spent 3 decades installing in my brain, the shame of being the difficult daughter, the ungrateful child, the one who always ruined everything for everyone else. They use your empathy as a weapon against you. They know you care deeply about the family's overall cohesion, so they threaten to destroy it and blame you entirely for the resulting wreckage. For years, I had internalized that toxic shame, convinced that setting firm boundaries was an act of selfish aggression. But watching those text messages roll in, the invisible spell finally broke. I realized that keeping the peace is just a polite name for slow self-destruction. I was not tearing the family apart. I was simply refusing to let them tear me apart any longer just to keep themselves comfortable and warm. That realization was the absolute armor I needed. I turned off the burner phone permanently and threw it in the bottom of a dark desk drawer. No contact is not a dramatic punishment designed to hurt people. It is a medical decision. It is the surgical removal of a cancerous tumor from your life. The IRS, as it turns out, moves slowly, but it moves with terrifying inevitability. 3 weeks later, Thomas's LLC accounts were officially frozen by the government pending a massive forensic audit. The $85,000 had triggered a cascading federal investigation into his last 5 years of corporate filings. He had been playing fast and loose with his taxes for a decade, and the luxury cruise receipts were merely the loose thread that rapidly unraveled his entire financial sweater. Because he had specifically used the stolen trust money to falsely inflate his business revenue, he could not simply declare bankruptcy to escape the incoming federal fraud penalty. He lost his business completely. He lost the heavily mortgaged suburban house. He and his wife had to pack their belongings and move into my parents' cramped guest bedroom. My mother desperately tried to use her substantial retirement accounts to bail him out of the mess, but the probate judge had already granted my attorney's emergency injunction. Her assets were locked down tight, frozen completely in place until the civil suit regarding her blatant breach of fiduciary duty was fully resolved. She was financially trapped in a house with the golden child she had ruined herself to protect, with absolutely no money available to maintain the wealthy, benevolent matriarch illusion she so desperately craved. The silence from their end of the world became absolute and permanent. I focused entirely on Lily and our future together. We packed up our few remaining belongings, permanently moved out of the temporary short-term rental, and bought a beautiful little house 2 entire states away. It was a quiet neighborhood with large oak trees, completely untethered from the toxic gravity of my dark past. I legally transferred the remaining trust funds into a new, heavily restricted account where I was the sole legal custodian, overseen closely by a neutral, court-appointed third-party fiduciary who required meticulous quarterly reporting. Lily got her brand new, upgraded Kochlear processors perfectly calibrated by a top specialist, and for the very first time in my 30 years of life, I watched her play happily in a bright, sunny backyard without the constant, looming shadow of my family's endless financial demands hanging over my tired head. The air in our new home felt wonderfully light. I was finally breathing clean, untainted air. But the human mind is a highly complicated, stubborn machine, and severing deep, lifelong trauma bonds is rarely as clean and straightforward as a decisive courtroom victory. The psychological conditioning of an entire childhood does not simply vanish overnight just because you won a legal battle. What happened next on a rainy Thanksgiving Day afternoon was the final, terrifying test of my hard-won, newfound resolve. That Thanksgiving morning was dark, the sky a bruised purple that poured freezing rain over the neighborhood. Inside, our house was warm, smelling of roasted turkey and cinnamon. Lily sat on the living room rug, piecing together a massive cardboard puzzle. This sheer domestic tranquility was something I had never experienced in my adult life. Then at noon, the doorbell chimed. I expected my neighbor, Mrs. Gable, who promised to drop off her pecan pie. This is where my vigilance failed me in a very mundane way. My security camera's battery died the night before, and in the chaos of unpacking our boxes, I completely forgot to charge it. I walked to the front door blind, turned the deadbolt, and pulled it open with a welcoming smile on my face. Standing on my porch, soaked by the freezing rain, were my mother and Thomas. They looked dramatically different from the arrogant, sun-kissed people who had breezed into that country club a month prior. Thomas looked haggard, his designer coat replaced by a cheap, ill-fitting windbreaker. My mother's makeup was severely smudged, her posture hunched and fragile. The wealthy matriarch illusion had been entirely stripped away, leaving only a desperate, angry old woman. She immediately lunged forward, trying to wedge her soaking wet leather boot into the doorframe to prevent me from closing it. "You cannot do this to us on Thanksgiving," my mother wailed, her voice cracking with practiced, theatrical misery. Thomas lost the house. We are living out of boxes. We drove 14 hours straight just to see you, just to see our beautiful golden grandchild. You have to let us in. We are family. You cannot turn family away on a holiday. It is inhumane. Thomas stood behind her, shivering violently. "Please," he muttered, his eyes refusing to meet mine. "Just let us come inside and talk. We have nowhere else to go." For a fraction of a second, the heavy, suffocating weight of my childhood rushed back into my lungs. The overwhelming urge to fix things, to absorb their misery so they could be comfortable, flared up in my chest. Let me tell you about trauma bonding, because it is the most insidious, invisible trap a toxic family system ever builds. A trauma bond is absolutely not love. It is a biological addiction to a manufactured cycle of abuse, superficial apology, and temporary, fragile peace. When you grow up in a system where love is constantly weaponized and strictly conditional, your brain learns to associate high-stakes anxiety with genuine affection. You are systematically conditioned to believe that if you just sacrifice a little more of your own sanity, if you just endure a little more of their pain, they will finally give you the safety and validation you desperately crave. You stay fiercely loyal to the people who actively hurt you because the intermittent reinforcement, those incredibly rare, fleeting moments of fake warmth, creates a powerful chemical hook in your brain. You convince yourself that their cruelty is just a symptom of their deep inner pain, and that your boundless empathy can eventually cure them. But your empathy cannot cure a narcissist. It only feeds their entitlement. Breaking a trauma bond feels exactly like going through physical withdrawal, because your body is literally detoxing from the constant chaos they manufactured to keep you compliant. I looked at my mother's foot wedged in my door. I looked at Thomas, the golden child who had happily stolen from a disabled 7-year-old girl to fund his luxury vacation. I waited for the familiar wave of crippling guilt to wash over me. I waited for the obligation to force my hand to open the door wider. But the guilt never came. Instead, my blood ran cold with absolute, unbreakable clarity. I did not cry. I took action. I did not scream at them. I kept my voice steady, lowering its register until it was barely more than a quiet, icy whisper. "Remove your foot from my house," I said. My mother gasped, recoiling as if I had physically struck her. "You are a monster," she hissed, the pathetic victim facade instantly dropping to reveal the pure, venomous hatred underneath. "You are a cold, ungrateful monster. And you are trespassing," I replied softly. "You have exactly 60 seconds to get off my property before I call the local police and have you both arrested." "Goodbye, Mother." I shoved the heavy wooden door forward. She pulled her foot back just before the thick oak slammed shut. I threw the deadbolt, latched the heavy security chain, and leaned against the wood. I listened to my mother pound her fists against the door, screaming my name into the freezing rain. She screamed for 5 agonizing minutes. I did not move. I did not speak. I just stood there, breathing in the warm scent of cinnamon from my kitchen, until the pounding finally stopped, and I heard the heavy tires of their car pulling away down the wet street. That was the exact moment the war truly ended. Boundaries are simply a description of what you will and will not accept in your life. Enforcing them is not an act of cruelty, it is an act of clarity. People who scream the loudest about family loyalty have almost always done the least to actually earn it. You cannot reason with someone who actively benefits from misunderstanding you. Leaving quietly, legally, and permanently is the most powerful thing you can do. It has been 2 years since that rainy Thanksgiving. Thomas is still dealing with the IRS fallout. My mother's assets remain tied up in the ongoing civil litigation. I haven't spoken to either of them since that day. Lily is thriving, her new implants working perfectly, her laughter filling our home every single day. I protected her future, and in doing so, I finally reclaimed my own. So what do you think? Did I go too far or not far enough? Let me know in the comments.